Thank you for joining us today. My name is Derek Miller, and I'm the president of the International Housewares Association. In today's webinar, we will explore PFAS chemicals, which are used to make thousands of different products, and pending PFAS legislation that is currently being implemented to regulate those products. As this legislation may have broad impact on a large number of home and housewares companies, this is a critically important topic. We're pleased to be working in conjunction with the Cookware Bakeware Alliance, the European Association for Cookware, Cutlery, and Flatware, and the law firm of Bryan, Leighton, Paisner. So that we can get directly to the content, I'll keep my comments brief and turn the rest of the webinar over to Peter Giannetti, who will be facilitating the discussion.
Thanks, Derek, and welcome to everyone in our audience today. As Derek said, today's roundtable discussion is intended to provide information to help manufacturers, marketers, and retailers prepare for PFAS regulations and their impact on the domestic and international housewares industry. I'm pleased to be joined today by three experts on the topic. Our panelists are Fran Groesbeck, Managing Director of the Cookware and Bakeware Alliance, also CBA, which is the U.S. Association of Cookware and Bakeware Suppliers. Tobias Gerfin, the CEO of Swiss kitchenware company Kuhn, Rikon, and President of the European Association for Cookware, Cutlery, and Flatware, otherwise known as FEC. And Thomas Lee, a partner in the Energy, Environment, and Infrastructure Practice Group of Bryan, Leighton, and Paisner, and the leader of the California-based law firm's PFAS practice. The panelists will take questions near the conclusion of the session. We'll be going for about 45 minutes and then open up to Q&A. You can post questions using the Q&A link at the bottom of the Zoom window. So let's get started. Fran, I'm going to start with you. I guess the place we all need to start today is, what are PFAS, PFAS, and how are they used in the manufacture of housewares products and other products? And I think I want the panel to discuss how the scope of this issue is much broader than nonstick cookware, which is where I think a lot of the discussion on PFAS originally began. Fran, give us a sense of what PFAS are and why they're involved in housewares right now.
I'm probably going to pull you into this part, Tobias, but I'll start it off with the product development, non-techie side. But PFAS is a group of over 5,000 chemicals that were created to improve or enhance a certain product or production or a different issue that or challenge that we faced. In actual consumer use, there's only about 700 that are used, so, but it's a big family. It's a big number of chemicals to watch. And within that family, there's some very distinct breakdowns that you have to go through, which we'll talk about in a second, but cookware falls into one of the breakdowns. But right now, PFAS is just looked at as this whole 5,000 chemical family. And it's why we're here today, is help kind of break that down a little bit. Can't do it in a half hour, but get some information and education out there. Know that both Tobias, myself, and Tom are here because we want to help educate. So if you have questions afterwards, please contact us. But where it comes into our industry is there's two types of when you look at PFAS, you have to start breaking it into subcategories. And the first breakdown is fluorochemicals versus fluoropolymers. And I'm going to let Tobias talk about chains, but the fluoropolymers are what started this in the cookware industry, and fluorochemicals are really where the problem lies. But Tobias, do you want to talk about chains for a second and the difference between the fluorochemicals and the fluoropolymers?
Definitely, I can do that. And I probably inherited that because from my background, I'm a chemist. So what are fluoropolymers, or what are PFAS? Well, it's chains, what Fran just mentioned. It's carbon chains. And if you link to just one carbon, 2 or 3 fluorine, then it's called the PFAS. This is a very broad definition, and unfortunately, it's not 5,000. Nobody knows how many. You can just make more and more of them. It's probably 8,000, 10,000. Only a few of them are used. And what Fran referred to is there is a distinct difference between short chains, maybe 8 carbon, 6 carbon, 7 carbon, and very long chains, which is the fluoropolymers. And these two have completely different properties. But as we will see in the legislation, they are thrown into the same basket with respect to legislation and regulation, which makes not much sense. I would dare to give an example. Let's take all the metals and say all metals behave the same just because they are metals. So it doesn't make sense to do it from chemical standpoint. And the problem that regulators have today, there are so many. And that's the reason why they decided to group them to make their life somehow manageable. But nevertheless, we have the fluorochemicals, chain lengths, maybe up to 15, maybe 20, and then you start with the fluoropolymers with completely different properties.
Can someone address the scope within Housewares? Again, I mentioned earlier that a lot of people think the fluoropolymer and the PFAS issue sort of started with the nonstick cookware business, and clearly that's a part of it. But this goes broader than that in terms of, and we'll get into the legislation a little bit different, but in terms of kind of a net that's being cast that encompasses all types of products that come in contact with food. So this is more than just a cookware issue. This is a broader Housewares issue. Can someone kind of determine help our audience understand the scope of the issue right now in Housewares?
Sure. Actually, I'm going to share a screen real quick to show you guys. This is a snapshot. Hoping everyone can see this. This is the definition of cookware from California AB 1200. And this is very common throughout the other legislation. But as you see, cookware means durable housewares, items that are used in homes and restaurants to prepare, dispense, or store food, foodstuffs, or beverages. So it includes pots, pans, skillets, grills, baking sheets, baking molds, trays, bowls, and cooking utensils. Some legislation goes on to just group it as consumer products. This is basically defining anything with or without a plug that comes in contact with food. And the other part of this legislation, which I don't have on the screen, is that the handle is also included in the AB 1200. So if something is intentionally added within any part of that definition and the handle, you're included. So since this basically says it's anything that comes in contact with food, we're all part of this. So and that's the biggest message.
And when I may add, the starting point of fluoropolymers are very often, or most of the time, are the fluorochemicals. And this is somehow where all the stuff started and the discussion started with PFOA and other substances, PFOS, that were banned some time ago, that they are not used anymore in coatings of all type. So this is the historical way where we are coming from. And now, today, we are looking at all the fluoropolymers, and they are thrown into the same basket, as I said. And Peter, you asked about the houseware application, but we have to open that up a little bit more. And I think this is what regulators were not prepared for, because it is used in so many applications. So if you look at energy, if you look at 5G, if you look at cars, if you look at medical applications, there are so many applications that nobody wants to ban the moment you hear about the benefit of the fluoropolymer. And that makes the situation difficult, because now the regulators are looking for fields where they can still use their approach. And here, the consumer goods and the houseware products are somehow a nice target. Well,
yeah.
Nice.
Tom, I'm going to direct this to you. There's 2 points here. One is that, there's this grouping of chemicals, and that we have to understand that those groupings may be too inclusive or possibly too inclusive. But the bottom line is, as we begin to discuss the state of legislative action and regulatory action right now, we have to deal with the fact that right now that's the way things are grouped. So are there 2 movements afoot right now to help regulators understand the differences, or is it really more about making sure we help the industry right now stay ahead of the legislation so they know what to do? As we go into the legislation, what's the primary objective right now?
I think in other areas of regulation, so PFAS regulation is happening across the entire environmental spectrum. It's everything from wastewater and air discharge permitting, site investigation and cleanup, consumer products, which is what we're here to discuss. So there are a number of different discussions going on with regulators that sort of vary depending on the field that you're talking about. In the consumer products space, in the houseware space, I think people have tried to make the, don't sort of mass regulate PFAS as a family argument. But to Tobias's excellent point, regulators have just pushed back on that, and so legislatures, because it is so difficult to get down to the granular level and identify specific PFAS compounds or even subsets of the overall PFAS family that, regulators just have sort of thrown up their hands and said, look, we're not doing that for consumer products. And I think, Tobias mentioned that there seems to be a convenient target on this industry space. And I think a lot of it is driven by public perception. If you Google PFAS, you will find endless articles. I mean, there was a Mark Ruffalo movie about PFAS impacts. There's a lot of public narrative out there about the health impacts. And frankly, a lot of it is inaccurate. And we don't really understand the health impacts. We have not studied the health impacts except for a small handful of these chemicals. I think the regulation and the move towards a PFAS as a family regulatory structure is in this space is driven by sort of a perceived need on the public side to address this in products that they interact with, they touch, they use. But I do think there is a lot of focus on the regulatory side in moving from a complete ban or reformulation requirement to a notice and labeling requirement. We've seen a lot of progress on that front. I think there are some valuable conversations to be had in that space. And I would just add to the excellent points that Fran and Tobias made about how this chemistry interacts with this industry. There is a new set of proposed regulations that relate to general product packaging and prohibitions on the presence of PFAS in packaging, which, that is miles beyond nonstick cookware. Right. So I agree with Fran. The definition of cookware is very broad, and it includes cooking utensils, which, we don't necessarily associate with true cookware. But the regulators are going well beyond that, and they're, right. They're looking at packaging, they're looking at, your manufacturing process. And I think part of the challenge on the industry side is we don't have a complete picture of how and where PFAS is used. It's constantly developing.
Right. Right. Fran, before I go back to Tom on the regulation issue, confronted with all of this information, the most important thing that I think we're going to try to convey is you need to be up to date on the information if you're in this business. The goal right now, yes, there's a lot of regulatory activity and there's movement here and there, but first and foremost, this industry needs to know where it kind of falls within the PFAS conversation. So I think one of the goals with this session today is to show that a collective effort to keep this industry engaged. Before we get to Tom, talk about that need to have the information out there and readily available.
It's so important right now. It's so important. Couple of things on this. This legislation's not going away. Many have passed. Tom will talk about those in a second. What he just touched on is so important. It's going to keep changing. We have these packaging laws coming. Those are big and extensive. That will impact all of us, no matter what your product is. Get educated, stay on top of it, be connected. And that's why we're here. We going to do a little update on what we're doing here, but with the CBA and the FEC, and Tom has been a big support to this. We're providing information, industry updates. We read and study these legislations as they change, and we're watching the search partner stronger together. Let's all come together, work together with the IHA, with everybody here. Let's figure out how to navigate this together. That's the biggest message, is get educated and let's stand together.
Right. And not only educated, but you have to be prepared. Depending on who is asking you as a company, your response time is different. If the question is coming from regulators or attorneys, you have more time. If it is coming from social media or media, classical media, you have a very short reaction time. And that means education is one thing, and that is what we're trying here. And CBA and FEC both, we are trying to give also support that you are prepared, that you can use position papers, that you can reference to videos to talk about the science behind it. If you're not prepared and you are in the middle of a storm, that would be very difficult. And unfortunately, all of us agreed in the discussions before, every company at some moment will be in the storm, because this will only grow. There's no question about that.
Yeah, and I think education and having those resources is so important, because there is a lot of confusion and lack of understanding at various levels of industry about what PFAS are, how are they used, how are they regulated, and the ability to sort of correct a narrative when you're talking to a customer or vendor is really essential, because we advise clients all the time on how to respond to these kinds of inquiries, and a lot of that effort is reframing the question in a way that actually makes sense for the chemistry, for the regulations, but you can't do that if you're not fully up to speed. So I agree.
Well, Tom, on that note, why don't we turn the conversation directly to you? If you can help provide a brief overview, if you can, of where we are with legislative action right now. I know there are some laws already enacted. There are several states that have pending legislation. So maybe you can help kind of prioritize the discussion a little bit in terms of what's coming now, but give our audience a sense of where we are with regulatory action across this country right now.
Sure, happy to. The challenge is to do it briefly, because there are a lot of things that have been passed or proposed, and they're all a little different. So I'm not going to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of each state's laws, but I kind of wanted to highlight some of the general themes that we're seeing in the regulatory structures, because we're seeing some of the same concepts repeated across the states. So I will share my screen here. Okay, so you'll see here, this is just a general map to give you a sense of what has been enacted, what has been proposed, and just geographically across the country where these things are coming up. And for those of us in the environmental space, it's not surprising to see a lot of states filled in on the coast, particularly in the Northeast and California, Washington. You sort of expect that, but I think it's interesting to see how much there is in the middle. And we don't have these slides today, but if you were to look at drinking water regulations, groundwater regulations for PFAS, you really get a sense for the fact that this is not a political issue. It's not, traditional Democratic Republican issue. It is a really widespread and sort of uniformly recognized issue, and we're seeing it across the country. But in terms of the specifics, so we've taken the previous slide and essentially broken it into 4 different categories. So there's 2 main buckets of regulation. There are regulations.
Tom, we still see the.
Can you move the slide forward?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Are you seeing, this is the original. Are you seeing this one, the
That's
orange and blue?
It's staying on the main, it's just on the first slide.
Well,
Why don't you try to close it and reopen it? Maybe that'll do it.
Yeah.
And reshare. There we go.
okay.
Now you can go back to the one before that, I think.
Okay, so this is the original slide. Hopefully you're able to see this one.
We're on slide number 3. Yes, we see the IHA, the cook, the household goods regulations.
Okay, well, it sounds like my wonderful slides are not cooperating with me, so that's fine. We can just talk it through. But generally speaking, there are sort of 2 categories of regulations. There are ones that require businesses in the houseware industry to provide a notice or some kind of reporting to a state agency. Sometimes it's a labeling requirement as well. And then there are regulations that outright ban or require some form of alternatives analysis for the chemistry and products. What's interesting from an advocacy standpoint is that most of the proposed laws are in the ban category, but most of the enacted laws are actually in the notice or labeling category. And that
Did those change at some point in progression? That they start out as ban legislation that sort of got pushed over to the labeling?
Yeah, a number of them did,
Yeah.
as a result of interactions with impacted industries and discussions with legislators about why this presents a challenge and may not actually reflect the best course going forward. So it just demonstrates that there is a lot of value in advocacy to try to address how these compounds are being regulated. But I kind of wanted to go one level further and talk about a few of the specific structures for how these laws are being rolled out. So in places like California and Colorado, Fran already mentioned AB 1200, there are labeling requirements, which are pretty onerous. And, Fran highlighted the definition of what falls under cookware. It's the same definition in California and Colorado. And it requires basically a label on the product itself, as well as a reference to a website that lists intentionally added chemicals that are on certain regulatory lists. Those include PFAS, but it's important to note, those include a lot of other compounds too. So for houseware products where you have a complex, product matrix, where you have metals and potentially other regulated compounds, your on-product label, the hang tag, will now have to list all of those chemicals. And it's a real challenge, both from a sort of customer interaction, marketing standpoint, and just from understanding what is in your product and making sure you're accurately, getting all that information on the label. So California, Colorado, very detailed labeling requirements. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have places like Minnesota and Vermont, where they've proposed, but have not enacted, a ban. Just a very broad, you cannot sell or distribute products in our state that contain PFAS. And then there's
What's the timetable for what? Let's go back for a second. The first three you mentioned, those are enacted laws that are coming into place when, Tom?
The labor requirements come into play in the next year or two, depending on which law you're talking about. So 2023, 2024 timeline.
Okay. And what about the bans as you start talking about those potential laws?
Typically, they're further out. So Minnesota and Vermont, we don't really know because they're not finalized. As written, they're fairly aggressive. But when you get into bans that have actually been passed, so you look at Maine, for example, they have sort of a two-tier approach. So under the Maine law, in 2023, you have to provide written notice of all intentionally added PFAS to Maine's environmental agency. Then in 2030, you have to have phased out all PFAS from your products, unless you can show that they're absolutely essential, there's no alternative you can possibly use, at which point you may be allowed to continue using them. So what we're seeing for the bans that have been passed, there is an acknowledgement by regulators that this isn't a switch that you can easily flip. It will take time for industry to adjust. There are, a few states in between. Massachusetts has an interesting proposal banning sale or distribution of cookware, which has the same definition as California. So we say cookware, but it's a broad category. Any cookware that has intentionally added PFAS or any PFAS, whether or not it's intentionally added, that is greater than 1 part per million of total fluorine. And without doing too deep a dive into the science here, that total fluorine test is a really interesting component to this whole PFAS discussion. So as Tobias mentioned, these are carbon fluorine molecules. but they can be relatively short chain, six carbon fluoride combinations, 8, or incredibly long. And what the total fluorine test measures what it sounds like. How much fluorine is in this sample that you sent me? And so it can include other fluorinated compounds that aren't PFAS. It sort of overrepresents the longer chain PFAS compounds and underrepresents the shorter chain, which are the ones that are typically what we're concerned about. But it's an easy test to do. And PFAS is a very hard family of chemicals to test for. So, total fluorine is something that, and I'll talk more about this at the end, something that's coming into discussions with vendors as sort of a proxy for PFAS-free, discussions with customers. But it is a very imperfect metric for your PFAS concentration in your product. So important to note in the context of Massachusetts that is part of their proposal.
Maybe Tom, maybe I can quickly, you just mentioned PFAS free. I think this is something that we see out of Colorado and we see it out of California, that they defined it very broadly. And in the past, we saw producers and brands saying no PFOA or PFOA free, but now it is broader defined. If any type of PFAS is in there, you're not allowed to say free of. And I think this is a recommendation from the direction we see at the moment. Maybe you can confirm that it should never be written on a product that has a fluoropolymer coating, that we just say, don't do it. I think this is a direction that is already clear. Is that correct?
That is in both Colorado and California. And it's not just, it doesn't matter if you have PFAS in there. That is a very clear statement. You cannot say free or free of.
And again, just to underscore the point here, people need to understand what the detailed language in these laws are right now. This is not about good intentions or bad intentions. It's about purely understanding what you need to know with regard to the law.
Opinion. This is I could pull it back up if I could show you.
No, that's okay. Yeah. And I'll try to get, if there's some slides that Tom had and they weren't working, if I can integrate them into some of the delivery after the session, we'll be able to do that for you. So Tom, you want to go ahead, Fran.
On this point though, about the language, and it really just ties to the message of this. You've got, it's the whole product that the legislation goes after, including the packaging. So from the engineering and the design to the packaging, and you have to be aware there's so many components, not to mention what Tom brought in of these other new packaging laws. But think about that, the packaging itself and what's written on there. So you have to plan that change, right? You have to plan the change for the website. And some of them, the timing is staggered. The website is first, the labeling is second. I think it's AB 1200. The website has to be up first, and then the packaging has some time to be added. But these are big things that need to be planned. Think about the running change. And we've had questions, and I'm not sure if this one's in the chat yet, but every time we bring up the packaging and the deadlines, a lot of people say, well, are you allowed a running change? According to what we see, the deadline's the deadline.
Right.
And there's also one other point of what Tom touched on with the list being not just PFAS in the ones that require labeling. There's footnotes in some of them that even say in the PFAS list that if it's not listed above, but you know it's a PFAS, it's your responsibility to report it. So this really gets very wide, very broad. And there's some really intense work that has to go into getting ready for these.
Tom, back to you. Any other details along these lines that, again, they don't, if you don't look at the fine print, you might miss them?
Yeah, I mean, I think one regulatory structure that probably a lot of you have had the displeasure of dealing with, but is really important in this context, is Proposition 65 here in California. So, you know, we've been talking about specific PFAS targeted laws. Prop 65, it includes PFAS compounds. They've been added to the list, and there are 3 named compounds: PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, but they expanded the PFOS definition to include any of its precursors or degradation compounds. So depending on how you define that, that's over 150 compounds easily. And so that applies to all products. It is industry agnostic. Anything you sell in California needs to comply with Prop 65. Now, it's a labeling law, it's not a reformulation law, but it's something that you need to consider. And I think it just further reinforces the fact that this is, we're dealing with a lot more than just nonstick cookware at this point.
Right.
And to Fran's point about, how you present the information, do you make claims about being PFAS free? I agree with everything that She and Tobias have said, that, I think that's not an advisable position at this point. And we've seen litigation risk around this. So we're talking mostly about regulatory risk today, but McDonald's and Burger King made claims about their food packaging being safe and consumer friendly. Plaintiffs groups tested it, found PFAS in it, and now those two companies are in lawsuits based on false advertising, false claims, allegations. So saying that, you made these public statements, they weren't true because there was PFAS in the product. So, when you're thinking about your marketing claims and how you interact with your customers, you need to think about both the regulatory environment, but also potential litigation risk.
I think there's something that we need to distinguish as we kind of talk about this. There are the before use sort of applications of the PFAS scenarios, and then there's the after use, the end of life, and how PFAS comes into those two different parts of the life cycle may be very different. Tobias, let me start with you. And why is it important to sort of understand those two distinctions, kind of the life cycle of PFAS, if you will?
Well, if you look at this movie that Tom was referring to, Dark Water, this was touching on the production side. The precursors were made and they were not handled properly. They were let into the environment, which is completely crazy to do that. So this is something that should never happen. So that is somehow the production of the product. These are professional people working in a professional environment, and the industry should know how to do that. And then you have the product itself. You have the use phase. The people is using a cookware or a utensil or something like that. And after the use, a couple of years, it is thrown away, and we go into the end of life. It is a disposal. It might go to landfill, which is terrible because we need the material back in our economy, or it is recycled. And in the recycling, there again are a lot of questions that open that have to be looked at. But I think, Tom, you can help me with the California law on recycling, because they have a law that says if something is coated, a non-stick coating based on PFAS, you're no longer allowed to mark it as recyclable. I think it's the SB 343, something like that. Maybe you can help me with that.
Yeah, that's right. And the relationship between recycling and PFAS is something that we're seeing come up in a lot of different contexts, both in terms of, what you're referring to, Tobias, and you're absolutely right. It's a California law that says, if PFAS are present, you can't claim that it's recyclable. It's also an issue for certain industries where there's a requirement that in their raw materials stream, they include a certain amount of recycled product. And that's a challenge if your recycled product, feed stream includes PFAS. Because, on the one hand, you're being told you can't sell products that contain PFAS, but you're also being told you need to include recycled products that may contain PFAS in your product. So it's, it's sort of this, you're caught between a rock and a hard place from a regulatory standpoint. So no, I completely agree. I think PFAS in this industry will have a lot of impact on your labeling, in whether it can be recycled, whether you can make products out of recycled feedstock.
Well, it shows the distinction between the kind of the reality of the PFAS application before, during, after, but from a consumer standpoint, all they hear is PFAS. And that kind of making everything clear along each of those steps is obviously a challenge. I'm jumping into a question that one of ours asked, and we'll get into it leads into the kind of conclusion of our discussion today, which is kind of, what else do we need to know, and what else do we need to do to prepare as an industry, and what are some best practices? But let's go back to the issue of what's being done to communicate to the consumer right now, and in a fair and balanced way. I think that's important for people to understand that that's the goal here. We know what we're doing here to educate the trade and the B2B aspect of it, but how are we going to get as an industry the message to the consumer? Fran, you want to start with that?
I would love to. We've been working really hard here at the CBA and with the support of the FEC, Tom, our members, to come up with a plan that doesn't just include industry. It goes broad scope from consumer to engineers to manufacturers and everybody in between, as well as, I'd like to say first, we are engaging legislators to help educate on this topic. That's starting now. For consumers tied to this legislation project, we are going to create a document, whether that ends up being a booklet or however long this ends up being, that is going to be available live. We're then going to work with some key media people to get that out there. We have several supporters, magazines and publications on the consumer front to help support us with significant followers and significant backing. We have videos we're preparing on YouTube that Tobias and I have done together to educate on PFAS, on both a more detailed, in-depth understanding of what PFAS is and all the different categories and industries it impacts. And then a second, there's actually 4 videos right now, but the second half of it is, well, what does it mean in cookware, and bakeware? Let's at least we educate on what that means. Those will be public facing. This will all be housed and shared on our website and the FEC as well. We have a section of our website called Good Science, and Good Science's tagline is knowledge seekers welcome. So whether you be a consumer, a legislator, or someone in the industry, we're going to do social promotion and other extensive press releases to share this information and make sure that people have access to the right information. For our members, we have additional support. We have a PFAS legislation tracker. We have industry updates, and these documents can then be sent to any end consumer, whether it's your retailer or the actual end consumer. And we also offer our members the support that these documents will have kind of a FAQ/cheat sheet that kind of a script for if your customer support team needs help in addressing these questions as they come in, because we all know the more knowledgeable we can all become and the quicker we can answer questions correctly and with good information, the more we'll calm this topic down.
Right. There are a lot of questions, as you can imagine, coming into today's roundtable discussion. Before I get to those questions, which kind of get to this what to do next sort of theme, a lot of these questions right now. Before we get to the questions, Tobias, let me start with you. Is there sort of one key or 2 key takeaways you would recommend people do just to get started in the process of understanding what they need to do to get ready for this?
There are 2 steps. One is you need to know where you have PFAS in. You need to know this now. And the second thing is then start working on the packaging and the website for the information. The time is very short. For the website, you have January 1st, 2023, it has to be on the website then. That is 4 months, 5 months out. That is not much time. And the second on the packaging, and if you do the packaging, take all the stuff and combine it. So free off has to go. All the information has to be on it. And you have to take off the recyclable at the moment because of the California law. So instead of making 3 times the packaging, because marketing people hate to do it 3 times, we really recommend that do it once, do it right, and to combine everything you know at the moment.
Right. Tom, Tobias makes a good point. While these are all different states doing different things, the participant in this, the manufacturer, the retailer, has to understand maybe the broadest scope of what's possible. Because you're not marketing your products to individual states. So you almost have to cast the net to encompass all of the current states that are going to be involved, and perhaps those that are coming down the pike. Is there a kind of a methodology to getting ready for all this that you're not in the manufacturing industry itself, you come from the regulatory side and understanding that. Is there a couple of points on a checklist that you want people to get started with right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Tobias's first point, maybe just to put a little more structure to that, understanding how you interact with the chemistry is always where we start. Anytime we're working with a new client on any PFAS issue, it's okay. You need to sit down and really look at your raw ingredients, if you're a manufacturer, all the way through your process flow into your finished products, and understand where there might be opportunities for PFAS to be entering that stream. And that can involve conversations with your vendors to understand what ingredients are in their products. Taking a pretty detailed look at your manufacturing flow, because if you're using municipal water or even groundwater in your production process, that could potentially be introduced in a lot of locations, will be introducing PFAS to whatever it interacts with. If you're extruding plastics, the liners for the molds often have PFAS in them. There are linings in tubes that move products around your facility. I feel like every time we look at this, we identify a new way that PFAS shows up in the manufacturing process. So starting early and having those conversations and doing that analysis is absolutely essential. You can't really make an educated decision about your regulatory obligations until you know where you are in your relationship with the chemistry.
And once you do that, what next?
Once you do that, yeah, I mean, I think to your point, you need to essentially decide whether if you sell in California, you have to comply with the California laws. And those are sort of a good high watermark for the labeling side requirements. And we do have a little more runway. We have about 7.5 years on the true bans, at least the ones that have been passed so far. So, I think step one, understand if you use the chemistry and where it is in your facility and your products. Step two, make sure that you are doing what you need to get into compliance with the California labeling and packaging requirements. And then step three, long-term, think about whether a continued use of the chemistry makes sense for your products, or whether this is something you want to sort of devote some CapEx and analysis to move away from as a chemistry as a whole.
Right. Fran, before we get started with some of these questions, is there anything you want to kind of close with regard to this kind of what can be done to start preparing for this? Anything more?
My biggest message is do something. Don't do nothing. Right? It's key.
Okay.
I believe, and we've all talked about this before, these legislators will be more understanding of you trying and maybe not doing it exactly right and working with you to adjust that than just saying, well, I don't understand it, or I think it's going to go away and doing nothing. It's so important. It's so important to try. And my other thing is, we touched on it, and more just the legislation, but get educated on the PFAS, not just for your sake, but to help better represent all the products that we're selling in this market. There's so much to the science. And I think the last is to really pay attention that it's not just cookware, it's more than that, and really go ask your questions of all your suppliers. For us, the first thing we always say is go ask all your suppliers. Put it on them to document and provide the documentation of what chemicals are in their stream, and just do those three things: get educated, do something, and start asking your questions. Get ready. Tom said, time's coming. It's coming fast.
Well, I've got about
and it
15
takes a long time.
Yeah, I've got about 15 minutes for a lot of questions right now. I'll do my best. I'm sure you're used to getting a lot of questions on this. I'll do my best to get to as many as possible that are really applicable here. The one that actually caught my mind, because we were talking with Tobias and Tom, Tobias especially was talking about the website warnings. Someone asked, does the website warning include all key e-commerce sites, such as Amazon, or just the manufacturers/distributors website? Anyone?
The website is from the person selling the product, and then Amazon and those others would have a link to that.
So there is no, Amazon doesn't directly have to put the content on its site, but it needs to link to it. That's the question.
It has to link to. So just think they are the digital brick and mortar. So
Okay.
just like on the brick and mortar shelf, the packaging will have the website, Amazon has to love the website. The website is on the responsibility of the person selling and making the product.
But in reality, it will be at some point on Amazon. There is no question, because Amazon will want to protect themselves. So at some moment, maybe not on January 1st for California, but at some moment we have to be ready, and there must be the link that this information is shared as well with Amazon or all the other big retailers.
Tom, your thoughts on that? How does the responsibility and liability sort of move downstream through the supply chain?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the primary responsibility in the California law for a website with the same information that would be on the label is on the manufacturer. However, Amazon and the other big e-commerce sites are very thoughtful about complying with these regulatory obligations. So they've been dealing with Prop 65 for decades now, and well, as long as they've been around, we'll say that. And they are very thoughtful about putting a link to, you know, either their own Prop 65 warning or to the manufacturer's warning. I expect this will be handled in the same way. From a sort of enforcement liability context, you need to look at your agreements with Amazon if you're selling with them directly, and often, you know, the vendor sites will allocate liability back to the manufacturer. So I think the short answer is the current regulatory responsibility for providing the website is on the manufacturer, and I think a lot of that long-term risk and liability may sort of end up with the manufacturer as well. But Amazon should be looking at this and on top of it.
There's one other point I just thought of. Amazon and other retailers who do private label are considered the manufacturer in that case.
Right.
So on those products, on any Amazon basics, and I don't mean to be targeting Amazon, it's anyone who has private label, it's just they're the name. They will be considered the manufacturer and have to comply in the same manner. So yes, actually, Amazon will have to have their own website and comply with these labeling laws on those fronts, and any retailer who does private label.
Someone asked if a list of chemicals has to be listed specifically on the packaging or website, or can it be a QR code or some other way of directing consumers to another website for that information? How do we kind of deal with that? Tom?
So under California, it needs to be on the label itself. There is a concerted effort to address that, because, you know, if you have to list not just all PFAS chemicals, but, you know, lead, cadmium, any phthalates that are in the product, you know, you could have a label that's quite big. So as of today, it needs to be on the label, but people are working on that issue. I don't really have a timeline for when any changes might be implemented, but there is an effort to address that.
There are some people asking if there's alternatives to the usage of free of that might be acceptable. So I'm asking if made without or any other manufactured without. Is there a way to be accurate and compliant without using the word free of, but saying something?
Made without is the technically accepted or more accurate way to state it. Means that, remember, these laws are about intentionally added. So your statement of made without means that you have done your due diligence and you have examined every supplier and you've done the complete chemical search in your product chain, and you know that no one has intentionally added. And the reason that intentionally added and made without, the difference too is the made without, and Tom touched on the test before and explained it. One of the tricky things with testing for PFAS is cross-contamination and ruling it out. So while we may create products, cookware and bakeware, gadgets, whatever it may be, and we've done our due diligence, and when that product ships in that plastic bag, and then somebody pulls it out to test it, if that plastic bag had PFAS in it and it's on the surface, it will come up on the test. But if you can prove then that you manufactured your product and you have done your due diligence that it is made without, then that statement is accurate. And if it came up in the test, then you could argue with the cross-contamination issue.
Although we have in Europe not the same litigation setup as you have in the US, I would be very careful, because Tom pointed that out very clearly. There are so many ways that PFAS can be found in a product. And when you say none or no or free of or made of, and then somebody makes a test and he finds 2 molecules, this might be a case for litigation. So looking from the other side of the pond, I would be very careful of using it in the marketing in the future.
Got it. Someone asked about elaborating on the use of water that might contain PFAS. If they rinse and wash the product and the other parts are not PFAS related, do they still need to consider it as something that is contains or made with PFAS? Tom?
That probably requires more chemistry aptitude than I have to,
Okay.
To help you figure out whether PFAS in the water will remain on the product if you wash it. So it depends on the product, it depends on the conditions, pH, a lot of different variables, but the way you can control for that is do some testing of your process water stream at whatever the inlet is, where the connection point is, to evaluate, what PFAS contribution may be coming from your water source. You can also go sort of one step removed from that, and if you're pulling from a municipal water supply, that municipality may have, and the treatment plant may have data showing what their PFAS concentrations are on their outfall. So, you can sort of do a desktop search, see what you can find. If you want to drill down further, you can test your own water to see what's in there.
But maybe a little side remark to that. Here, the system is freaking out because if you have some molecules of PFAS, like let's take PFOA on the surface through cross-contamination or whatever, if you look up, you can do that just after the webinar, check the LD50, so it's a toxicity value for PFOA, and you compare it to caffeine, you will find that they are similar. And we all drink coffee all the time. So, and the amount that by cross-contamination we have on a product is very, very low. So there we still have to follow the rule, so we cannot do it, but we are just over-regulating it. So it's unfortunately we have to do it, and I would strongly recommend that everybody is going as strict as possible, but chemically that makes absolutely no sense.
There's a couple questions here related to Prop 65 for people looking for some clarity. One of them is it best to use the Prop 65 wording for labeling and website warnings to encompass and account for PFAS? And others, or someone else asked if it's been tested appropriately, do they have to? Let me ask the question specifically here. Hold on a second. Might have dropped. They might. Oh no. In California, if a product is tested by a testing agency and passes, do they still need to include the Prop 65 label on the product and packaging? I think that looks beyond PFAS, that question a little bit, but
Sure.
Yes. But back to the original question, is the Prop 65 language enough to encompass and account for PFAS?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of how to answer this question without giving you 20 minutes on Prop 65, which I'm happy to do if anybody is curious. But short version is, under Prop 65, you have to provide a warning. And that warning needs, if there are 2 health endpoints, cancer or reproductive toxicity, you need to provide a warning to your customers of at least one chemical for each of those endpoints. So under the new labeling requirements, you have to identify specific chemicals. So now you have to say this product contains lead, whereas before you just said it contains chemicals known to the state of California. There are a lot of chemicals, including some PFAS, that are identified as both carcinogens and reproductive toxicants. But there are other chemicals out there too, metals as well. So for example, if you sell a product that you reasonably believe contains lead in it, and it may also contain PFAS. We don't know, maybe you know, or maybe you don't. Your label, your Prop 65 warning label, can say this product contains lead, which is known to the state of California to be a carcinogen and a reproductive toxicant. And that's the only compound you have to identify. So that warning is sufficient to cover any other carcinogen or reproductive toxicant that's in your product. All you have to do is identify one. You don't have to identify all of them. AB 1200 is different in that you have to identify all of the compounds that are on the relevant regulatory list. So I think that's the distinction there. And, you know, traditional Prop 65 warning, just one chemical for each endpoint, and that can just be one chemical for both. AB 1200, long label with everything on it. To the second question in terms of testing, so a lot of companies will contract with, you know, one of the large testing labs to test for a suite of chemicals, and they test against standards for Prop 65 compliance. Typically, you know, the way they come up with those lists is they look at what kind of product it is and what compounds they would expect to see in that product. And if you pass, then you don't need a warning label. I think PFAS is a unique challenge in that we're still learning what products it's in. So, and it is very difficult for the labs to test for the compound in sample matrices that are anything other than water. Water they can test for, but you know, you send them a piece of metal, it's really hard for them to do an accurate extraction and analysis of the PFAS in it. So, you know, generally speaking, yeah, if you get a passing test result from your lab, then you know you're fine, and you don't need to provide a Prop 65 warning. But PFAS complicates that conversation. I think you would want to at least have a conversation with the testing lab about whether PFAS should be included in your testing based on the type of product.
And to add to that, now go back to AB 1200, not the Prop 65, asking about this question regarding testing. It's not about being able to provide a test that says you have no PFAS in your finished product. The question is, have you intentionally used PFAS in any part of the product life, from manufacturing through to the selling floor? That's what they want to know, because the whole goal of these PFAS laws is to reduce the harmful ones from use. And in the case of AB 1200, I just want to say this. I know we sound like we're very heavy on this legislation. While there is still some things to be defined, like how do you list on a gadget tag all the chemicals inside, and those things will be worked out. The labeling ones are right to know laws, and consumers have a right to know what's in there. And yes, they're going to be complicated. Yes, we have to create websites. Yes, there's a lot of work, but these are with good intention. So, and there's a lot of work to be done, but I just wanted to say that the right to know laws are trying to do a good thing, and they're handling it in a much better manner than the ones that are just trying to outright ban and not realizing the industry's impacting. But it's not about having a test that shows you have no PFAS. Right. You have it. It's the whole life of the product.
I want to thank Fran Groesbeck, Tobias Gerfin, and Tom Lee for helping us get started and getting into some of the depth of this. There's so much more to discuss. Fran at the CBA has talked about what they're doing there to help keep the industry informed. We will do our best at IHA to stay connected to all of those developments and help the industry understand that this PFAS issue is a broad industry issue. It encompasses many aspects of the business, from production to end of life. It encompasses a lot of different product categories. I think people now are trying to figure out whether their product falls in the list of affected products. So you might have an opportunity to help explain that. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Stay tuned to homepagenews.com and housewares.org, as well as the website affiliates of CBA, FEC, and Tom's firm. We will keep you informed on PFAS going forward. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you very soon. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.